Hello, survivors. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the story. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe to our channel. We appreciate it, and thank you in advance. Please leave the name of the city you're listening from in the comment section below. It helps us see our reach in the community. Let's start the story. 23 years behind the wheel. Same cracked vinyl seats, same coffee-stained dashboard, same scratched plexiglass partition separating me from whatever drunk, desperate, or dangerous passenger slides into my back seat. October nights in Detroit were all the same. Cold, wet, and filled with people who needed to be somewhere else. The radio crackled with dispatcher chatter as I cruised down Woodward Avenue. Car 47 pickup at Madison and 3rd. Not my call. I kept driving, windshield wipers fighting the drizzle that made the neon signs blur into watercolor streaks. The heater rattled like it was dying, which it probably was. Everything in this city was dying, one rusted piece at a time. My phone buzzed. Text from Linda. Rent's due tomorrow. Don't come home empty-handed again. 17 years of marriage, and that's what it came down to. I pocketed the phone and turned up the radio, letting the dispatcher's monotone voice wash over me. Another night, another handful of crumpled bills that wouldn't be enough. The first pickup was routine. Business guy in an expensive suit, probably worked downtown, catching a ride home to the suburbs. Slid into the back seat with his phone already pressed to his ear. Bloomfield Hills, he said, then went back to his conversation. No, Karen, I told you, the meeting ran long. Yes, I know what time it is. I pulled into traffic and caught fragments of his argument through the partition. Standard stuff, late nights, missed dinners, the usual corporate drone complaints. But as we drove north on Woodward, his voice got sharper. What do you mean they're not letting people leave? Which hospital? A pause. Mount Sinai? That's impossible. There's no quarantine. Karen? He pulled the phone away from his ear, staring at the screen. Driver, can you turn around? I need to get to Mount Sinai Hospital. That's back downtown. You sure? My wife works there. She just said they're not letting staff leave the building, something about a medical emergency. I made a U-turn at the next light. In the mirror, I watched him try calling back, but the phone just rang and rang. His confident corporate demeanor was cracking around the edges. Radio's been weird tonight too, I mentioned, adjusting the dial. Nothing but static on most stations. Lot of interference. He leaned forward. What kind of interference? Before I could answer, we hit construction on Jefferson. Orange cones forced us into a single lane, and that's when I saw the ambulances. 4 of them, lights flashing, racing toward downtown. Then 3 more. In 23 years, I'd never seen that many emergency vehicles at once outside of a major accident. Jesus, the businessman muttered. What's going on out there? I dropped him at Mount Sinai, where he joined a small crowd of family members pressed against the locked entrance doors. Security guards stood inside, gesturing for people to back away. Nobody was getting in. The next fare was waiting at a bus stop on Cass Avenue. Young woman, maybe 25, clutching a purse like her life depended on it. She practically threw herself into the back seat. Wayne State University, she said, breathing hard. The dorms fast. You all right, miss? My roommate. She was supposed to meet me at work 2 hours ago. She's not answering her phone. Her voice was tight with worry. I went by her boyfriend's place, but his neighbor said there was screaming earlier. Police came and went, but they wouldn't say what happened. As we drove through the university district, I noticed more ambulances, more police cars. The usual college crowd was thin tonight, like people were staying indoors. The few students I saw walking were moving quickly, heads down, staying in groups. Here's fine, she said when we reached the dormitory. She shoved a 20 through the slot and was out the door before I could make change. I watched her run to the building, using her key card to get inside. Through the glass doors, I could see her talking animatedly with someone at the front desk, gesturing wildly. Whatever she was hearing, it wasn't good news. The radio crackled as I pulled away. Car 23, respond to receiving hospital. Emergency pickup. Car 23 responding. What's the nature of the emergency? Medical transport, priority 1. I'd never heard dispatch use priority 1 before. In my experience, everything was either routine or expedite. Hurry up, but not too much. Priority 1 sounded official, military almost. My next pickup was at a 24-hour diner on 8 Mile. Guy in his 50s wearing scrubs under a winter coat. He looked exhausted, like he'd been working a double shift. "Detroit General," he said, settling into the seat with a heavy sigh. "You work there?" "Nurse. Been pulling extra shifts all week. We're swamped." He rubbed his eyes. "Started 3 days ago. People coming in with flu symptoms, but nothing we've seen before. High fever, delirium, aggressive behavior. Flu season starting early? That's what we thought. But the CDC called this morning. They're sending a team." He paused. "In 30 years of nursing, I've never seen the CDC get involved in a local flu outbreak." We stopped at a red light, and an ambulance screamed past us, followed by another. The nurse leaned forward to watch them go. "That's the 8th one I've counted tonight," he said quietly. "All heading to different hospitals. Henry Ford, Mount Sinai, St. John's. Something's happening and nobody's talking about what it really is." "What do you think it is?" He was quiet for a long moment. "The patients we've been seeing, they're not responding to standard treatments. Sedatives don't work. Pain medication doesn't work. It's like their nervous systems are different." "Different how?" "Heightened aggression, increased pain tolerance, and the biting." He shook his head. "Never seen anything like it. 3 nurses have been injured this week, all bite wounds." The light turned green, and I accelerated toward downtown. The streets were eerily quiet now. Most businesses closed despite it only being 10 p.m. "Drop me at the emergency entrance," the nurse said as we approached Detroit General. "And driver, stay away from the hospitals tonight, all of them." He handed me exact change and hurried toward the building. Through the glass doors, I could see the emergency room was packed. People sat in every available chair, some slumped over, others pacing restlessly. Security guards stood at strategic points, and I noticed they were wearing protective equipment, face masks, gloves, some kind of body armor. My radio crackled. "All units be advised. Avoid downtown corridor between Cass and Brush. Multiple incidents reported." I keyed the mic. "Dispatch, what kind of incidents?" "Just avoid the area, car 19. That was unusual. Dispatch always gave details: accident, violence, construction, never just avoid the area. In 23 years, I'd never heard them be so vague. I was heading back toward my usual hunting grounds when I saw him. Corner of Cass and Temple, just outside the emergency room entrance of Detroit General. Guy in a gray hoodie, hunched over like he was carrying the weight of the world. Even from half a block away, I could see he was in bad shape. He raised his arm, the universal signal for taxi, and I pulled over. But as I got closer, something made me hesitate. Maybe it was the way he moved. Maybe it was how pale his skin looked under the streetlights. Or maybe it was what the nurse had said about staying away from hospitals. He stumbled toward the cab, and when he opened the door, the smell hit me immediately. Metallic and rotten, like meat left too long in the sun. "Where to?" I asked, trying to breathe through my mouth. "Mount Sinai," he wheezed, slumping into the back seat. His voice sounded like gravel in a blender. "Need to get there fast." I glanced in the rearview mirror. His face was pale, almost translucent, with dark circles under his eyes that looked like bruises. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the October chill. "You sure you don't need to stay at Detroit General? You look pretty sick." "No," he said, more forcefully than I expected. "Mount Sinai, please, just drive." I hit the meter and pulled into traffic. That's when I noticed his breathing, shallow, rapid pants that fogged up the window behind me. Every few seconds, he'd wipe his nose on his sleeve, and the tissue came away dark. The radio was playing some late-night talk show when it cut to a news bulletin. Reports of disturbances at several area hospitals. Detroit General, Henry Ford, and Mount Sinai are all reporting unusual patient volumes this evening. City health officials are asking residents to avoid hospital emergency rooms unless absolutely necessary. My passenger's head snapped up. "Turn it up." I reached for the volume knob, but the bulletin was already over, replaced by static. The signal was getting weaker. "What was that about?" I asked. "Nothing," he muttered, but his voice had changed. Weaker, more strained. "Just drive faster." We were heading south on Woodward when I heard the first cough. Wet, violent, like something was trying to tear its way out of his chest. I glanced in the mirror and watched him double over, hands pressed to his mouth. When he pulled his hands away, they were covered in blood. "Jesus, man, you're really sick. Maybe we should turn around. Get you to... Don't stop." His voice was barely a whisper now, but there was something desperate in it. "Please, don't stop." That's when the radio went completely to static, and in the distance I heard the first screams. The screams were coming from ahead of us, somewhere near the intersection of Michigan and Cass. As we got closer, I could see why traffic was backing up. Cars were stopped at odd angles, some with their doors hanging open. A city bus sat sideways across 2 lanes, emergency lights flashing but no driver in sight. "What's going on?" my passenger whispered, his breathing getting more labored. I rolled down my window, trying to hear over the idling engines and distant sirens. That's when I saw her, woman in a hospital gown, standing in the middle of Michigan Avenue like she owned the place. Even from a block away, I could tell something was wrong with the way she stood. Too still, too rigid, like a mannequin someone had propped up and forgotten. Traffic crept forward and the details became clearer. Her gown was torn, hanging in strips that fluttered in the October breeze. Dark stains covered the fabric, spreading out from what looked like claw marks across her chest and arms. But it was her face that made my stomach turn. The skin hung in tatters, revealing glimpses of bone underneath. Her jaw hanging, like it had been partially torn away. One eye socket was empty, just a black hole in her skull, while the other eye stared straight ahead with an intensity that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. "Drive around her," my passenger gasped from the back seat. "I can't, traffic's backed up." Other drivers were starting to panic. Car doors slammed as people abandoned their vehicles, running back the way they'd come. A woman in a SUV 3 cars ahead was screaming into her phone, pounding on her steering wheel. Behind us, someone laid on their horn in long, desperate blasts. The sound seemed to excite the woman in the hospital gown. Her head snapped toward us with a movement so sharp I heard vertebrae pop. When her remaining eye found mine through the windshield, something cold settled in my stomach. That eye wasn't right. It was focused, but not on anything that mattered. Like looking at someone who was sleepwalking, except she was wide awake and hungry for something I didn't want to think about. She started walking toward us. Not walking, shambling, like her legs didn't remember how to work together. Each step was uncertain, but she never stopped looking at us with that empty, ravenous gaze. Her mouth hung open, and I could see her tongue working against the remains of her teeth. "Drive," my passenger said, his voice stronger suddenly. "Drive now." I threw the cab in reverse and punched it, tires squealing as I backed into the car behind us. The other driver was already getting out, shouting something I couldn't hear over the blood pounding in my ears. But he stopped shouting when he saw the woman. She had reached the front of my cab and was pressing her ruined face against the windshield, leaving streaks of blood and something darker I didn't want to identify. Her mouth moved against the glass, and I could hear the scraping of teeth, like fingernails on a chalkboard. The smell hit me then, decay and copper, and something sweet that made my gorge rise. It seeped through the cab's ventilation system, thick and cloying. I yanked the wheel hard right, bumping up onto the sidewalk. The woman slid off the hood and collapsed onto the asphalt with a wet thud. For a moment, she lay still, and I thought maybe she was finally down. Then she started getting back up. Her movements were all wrong, limbs bending at angles that should have been impossible, using her broken jaw to push herself upright. But she was moving and those eyes were still locked on us. Jesus Christ, I breathed, flooring the accelerator. In the rearview mirror, I watched her stand fully upright, swaying slightly but still focused on our retreating taillights. Other people were running now, abandoning their cars in the middle of the street. Some ran toward us, others away, but they were all running from something. Behind the woman, more figures were emerging from between the abandoned vehicles. They dragged bodies sideways, and they were all heading in the same direction, toward the people who were still trying to get away. "What the hell was that?" I shouted, but when I looked back, my passenger was slumped against the door, eyes closed, breathing so shallow I couldn't tell if he was still alive. The radio crackled weakly. "All units. Reports of violence. Multiple locations. Avoid downtown." I turned it up, but the signal was dissolving into static between words. "Hospital patients. Aggressive behavior. Avoid contact." My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. In 23 years of driving cab in Detroit, I'd seen everything. Drug deals, domestic violence, gang shootings, but nothing like this. Nothing that made every instinct I had scream at me to get as far away as possible. Mount Sinai was still 10 minutes away through surface streets. I could take the freeway, but something told me to stay away from major arteries tonight. The radio was almost completely static now, and when I managed to catch fragments of other stations, the news wasn't getting any better. State of emergency. Multiple casualties. Citizens advised to barricade. I checked the back seat again. My passenger was definitely unconscious now, maybe worse. Blood had pooled on the seat beneath him, dark and thick in the dim light of passing street lamps. His skin had taken on a grayish tint that reminded me too much of the woman we'd just left behind. That's when I heard more screaming, closer this time, and realized that whatever was happening wasn't contained to just one intersection. It was spreading. The passenger in my back seat stopped breathing somewhere around Grand Boulevard. I'd been checking on him every few minutes, watching his chest rise and fall in increasingly shallow gasps. Then, at a red light, I realized the silence behind me wasn't just quiet, it was complete. No breathing, no movement, nothing. "Shit," I whispered, pulling over to the curb. My hands shook as I turned around to check his pulse, but I already knew what I'd find: cold skin, no heartbeat, eyes rolled back showing only white. I should have called 911, should have followed protocol, but the radio was nothing but static now, and after what I'd seen on Michigan Avenue, I wasn't sure there was anyone left to call. Instead, I did what any rational person would do when faced with a corpse in their cab. I got the hell out of there. Pulling back into traffic, I tried not to think about the dead man behind me, tried not to remember what the nurse had said about patients not staying down. The October air felt colder somehow. That's when my phone rang. Katie's ringtone, "Don't Stop Believin'," because she'd always been optimistic, even as a kid. "Dad! Dad, thank God!" Her voice was tight with panic. "I've been trying to reach you for hours." "I'm working." "What's wrong, sweetheart?" "I came home from school, but something's happening. The neighbors are acting weird and there's sirens everywhere. Dad, I'm scared." "My daughter. My 19 years old, second year at Wayne State, living at home to save money." My chest tightened like someone was squeezing my heart. "Are you at the house?" "Yeah." I locked myself in my room. "Dad, Mrs. Henderson came to the door an hour ago, but she looked wrong, really wrong." I was already making a U-turn. I was heading toward home. The dead man in my back seat made a soft sound, just a groan, like someone waking up from a deep sleep. But dead men don't make sounds. "Pack a bag," I told Katie. "Just essentials. We're leaving the city tonight." "Leaving?" "Dad, what's going on?" "I'll explain when I get there. Stay in your room and don't open the door for anyone except me." The dead man in my back seat was sitting up now, staring at nothing. His mouth worked silently, jaw opening and closing. There was no recognition in those eyes, no awareness, just hunger. He lunged forward, slamming against the partition with enough force to crack the plexiglass. I dropped the phone and yanked the wheel hard right, sending the cab careening into a parking lot. The impact threw my passenger against the side window, but he barely seemed to notice. He just kept reaching for me, fingers scraping against the damaged partition. The plexiglass was holding, but barely. Hairline cracks spread from the impact point, and I could hear it creaking under the pressure of his pounding. I grabbed my phone from the floorboard and bailed out of the cab, leaving the door open and the engine running. Behind me, I could hear him throwing himself against the partition again and again. An old Honda Civic sat in the corner of the parking lot, Windows down, keys dangling from the ignition. The kind of stupid mistake that usually ended with a stolen car, but tonight it might save my life. The Honda's engine turned over on the second try. In the rear-view mirror, I watched the thing that had been my passenger break through the partition and stumble out of the cab. It didn't chase me, just stood there, swaying slightly before wandering toward other cars in the lot. Home was in Dearborn, 20 minutes on a good day. Tonight it would take me through the heart of a dying city. I pulled onto Michigan Avenue and immediately knew I'd made a mistake. The main drag was chaos. Cars abandoned at crazy angles, some with their doors hanging open like their occupants had fled mid-drive. A city bus sat sideways across 3 lanes, black smoke pouring from its engine compartment. Bodies lay scattered on the asphalt, some motionless, others twitching. A woman crawled across the pavement, dragging her broken legs behind her, leaving a dark trail on the concrete. I threw the Honda in reverse and backed down a side street. 23 years of driving these roads was paying off now. I knew every shortcut, every alley, every way to avoid the main arteries where the chaos would be worst. Werner Highway was my next try. Better, but not by much. A pharmacy was burning on the corner, the windows blown out, people running in and out carrying whatever they could grab. Some of them moved normally, frantic but human. Others had gray skin, empty eyes fixed on nothing but still searching. I watched a man in a torn security guard uniform stumble out of the pharmacy, his throat torn open, exposing windpipe and muscle. He should have been dead, but he kept walking, kept looking around with those with eyes. A group of teenagers ran past my car, screaming, backpacks bouncing as they sprinted down the sidewalk. Behind them came more of those gray figures, not running but walking. They moved like they had all the time in the world, like they knew their prey would eventually tire. I floored the Honda, weaving between abandoned cars and debris. A pickup truck had crashed through the front of a liquor store, and the owner was standing in the wreckage with a shotgun, firing at anything that moved. But the things he was shooting at didn't stop. They just kept coming, even with massive wounds in their chests. Headshots, I muttered, remembering what the nurse had said. Only headshots work. I turned onto Fort Street thinking it would be clearer, but ran straight into gridlock. Cars were packed bumper to bumper, horns blaring, people screaming at each other through rolled-down windows. Some had gotten out of their vehicles and were fighting over who could go first, while others just sat behind their steering wheels, staring straight ahead in shock. And moving through it all were the infected, drawn by the noise and the crowd. They squeezed between cars, pressed their faces against windows, leaving bloody handprints on glass. I watched a minivan 3 cars ahead of me rock back and forth as something tried to get inside. The family in the back seat was screaming. I couldn't help them. I couldn't help anyone. I had to get to Katie. I yanked the wheel hard right and drove up onto the sidewalk, scraping the Honda's undercarriage against the curb. Pedestrians scattered, some running toward me for help, others away from me in fear. I couldn't tell which ones were infected and which were just terrified survivors. A woman in hospital scrubs pounded on my passenger window as I drove past. Her face was streaked with blood and she was screaming something I couldn't hear over the engine noise. In my side mirror, I watched her stumble back into the crowd and 3 gray figures converged on her. I had to look away. The side streets were marginally better, but every block brought new horrors. A school bus sat empty in the middle of Springwell Street, its windows shattered, small backpacks and lunchboxes scattered on the asphalt around it. I didn't want to think about what had happened to the children. An apartment building was burning on the corner of Clark and Werner, fire trucks abandoned in front of it with their doors hanging open. The firefighters' gear lay scattered on the ground, helmets, oxygen tanks, axes, but no sign of the men who'd worn them, except for the shapes moving inside the burning building, silhouetted against the flames. They weren't running from the fire. They were just wandering through it, their clothes smoking. Skin blackening, but still moving. I had to stop at Dix Avenue because a semi-truck had jackknifed across the intersection. The driver was still in the cab, slumped over the steering wheel, but his passenger door was hanging open. Dark stains covered the truck's windshield from the inside. As I sat there, engine idling, trying to figure out another route, something tapped on my driver's side window. An old man in a bathrobe and slippers stood beside the car, his face pressed against the glass. His eyes were clouded over, pupils dilated so wide they looked black. Drool leaked from the corner of his mouth, and when he opened it, I could see that his tongue was black. He wasn't asking for help. He was trying to get in. I gunned the Honda backward, tires squealing, and took the next right turn. The old man didn't chase me, just stood there in the middle of the street, turning slowly like he was searching for the next sound to follow. Lanyo Street was blocked by police cars, their red and blue lights still flashing but no cops in sight. The barriers they'd set up were overturned, yellow crime scene tape fluttering in the October breeze like party streamers. I drove around the roadblock through somebody's front yard, crushing their flower bed under the Honda's tires. The owner would never complain. I could see him through his living room window, or what was left of him. He was missing most of his face, but he was still moving, still pressing himself against the glass, trying to get outside. Miller Road finally gave me a clear shot toward home, but it came with its own nightmare. A family was trying to load their SUV with suitcases, 3 small children crying while their parents shouted at each other about what to take and what to leave behind. They never saw the infected woman emerge from between 2 houses, moving toward the sound of their argument. She wore a blood-stained apron over her dress, like she'd been interrupted while cooking dinner. Her gray hair was matted with something dark, and her mouth worked constantly, jaw grinding against nothing. I wanted to warn them, wanted to stop and help. But Katie was waiting, and every second counted. I drove past, watching in my rearview mirror as the woman reached the family. The parents were still arguing about their luggage when she grabbed the father's shoulder and sank her teeth into his neck. His scream followed me for 3 blocks. By the time I reached the Dearborn city limits, the Honda's engine was overheating from all the stop-and-go driving, and my hands were cramped from gripping the steering wheel. But I was almost there, almost home. Our neighborhood sat in the middle of a residential grid, tree-lined streets with small brick houses where people had lived and worked and raised their children for decades. Tonight, those familiar streets felt like a maze designed to trap us. I turned onto our block and immediately hit the brakes. Mr. Patterson from 4 houses down was standing in the middle of the street, still wearing his postal service uniform. But his mailbag was torn open, letters scattered around his feet like confetti, and his face was a ruin of torn flesh and exposed bone. He turned toward the sound of my engine, and I saw that one of his eyes was missing. The socket a dark hole that seemed to look right through me. His mouth opened and closed rhythmically, like he was trying to deliver a message but couldn't remember the words. I drove around him slowly, and he followed the car's movement with his remaining eye, turning his body in a slow circle as I passed. In my rearview mirror, I watched him start walking in the direction I'd gone, patient and determined. 2 more blocks. That's all I needed. 2 more blocks to reach Katie. Our house sat on a quiet residential street, the kind of neighborhood where people still knew their neighbors' names, or used to. Tonight, that familiarity would become a nightmare. I parked the Honda in our driveway and ran to the front door. It was locked, which was good. I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking from adrenaline. "Katie, it's me." The door opened and Katie threw herself into my arms. She was crying, her whole body trembling. "Dad, thank God. I was so scared." "It's okay, sweetheart, I'm here now." She looked up at me with those brown eyes that reminded me so much of her mother. "Dad, what's happening?" The news stopped working and I keep hearing screaming. "I don't know exactly," I said, which was partially true. "But we need to leave. Did you pack a bag?" "Yeah, it's upstairs." I went to the basement and retrieved the .38 revolver I'd bought after a particularly bad night driving cab in the wrong neighborhood. 6 bullets. I hoped it would be enough. That's when we heard the scratching at the front door. Slow, methodical scratching, like fingernails on wood. Then a voice, Bob Henderson's voice, but wrong somehow. Thick and wet. "Danny? Danny, you home? Need to talk." I looked out the living room window. Bob stood on our front porch, but he wasn't the man I'd known for 15 years. His clothes were torn and stained with something dark. His face was pale, almost gray, and his mouth hung open, revealing teeth stained red. Behind him, his wife Susan swayed on the walkway, her floral dress ripped at the shoulder. She was missing an eye, the socket a dark hole in her skull. "Back door," I whispered to Katie. "Cars in the driveway." We crept through the house, avoiding the windows. The scratching at the front door was getting more insistent, and I could hear Bob's voice calling my name over and over. The back door opened onto our small yard, separated from the Hendersons by a chain-link fence. Their yard was a scene from hell: overturned lawn furniture, scattered trash, and dark stains on the grass that I didn't want to think about. We were halfway to the car when the fence rattled. Mrs. Chen from 2 houses down was pressing against the chain link, her fingers threading through the wire mesh. Her white hair was matted with blood, and her house dress was torn down the front. She'd been Katie's babysitter when Katie was little, used to make the best dumplings in the neighborhood. "Katie," she called in a voice like broken glass. "Katie, come here. So hungry, so hungry." Katie whimpered and pressed against me. "Dad, that's Mrs. Chen. What's wrong with her? Don't look at her. Get in the car." But Mrs. Chen was already climbing the fence, her movements awkward but determined. Other shapes were moving in the darkness, more neighbors. I got Katie into the Honda just as Mrs. Chen dropped into our yard. She stumbled toward us, arms outstretched, and I could see that her fingernails were broken and bleeding from clawing at the fence. "Danny!" Bob's voice came from around the side of the house. "Danny, where are you?" I started the engine and backed out of the driveway fast. In the headlights, I saw Bob and Susan shambling around the corner, moving faster now that they'd heard the car. Bob's eyes reflected the light like an animal's, and his mouth was working silently, teeth gnashing at empty air. "Oh my God," Katie whispered. "What happened to them?" "I don't know, sweetheart," I said honestly. "But we need to get out of here. There might be flights out of the city." We drove through our neighborhood, past houses where Katie had grown up riding her bike on these same streets. Now those streets were full of our former neighbors. They charged with heads low and arms wide. The Kowalskis from the corner house stood in their front yard, tearing at something on the ground. The Martinez family wandered aimlessly through their flower garden. Except they weren't a family anymore. They were just 3 gray shapes in blood-stained clothes. "Dad, where are we going?" Katie asked, her voice small. "Airport. If there are still flights out, we'll get on one." Detroit Metropolitan Airport was across the city, but I knew the back roads. 23 years of driving cab had taught me how to avoid traffic, how to find the fastest route from any point A to any point B. Even with the city falling apart, I could get us there. We took Telegraph Road south, then cut east on side streets that most people didn't know existed. The radio was nothing but static now, but we didn't need it to know what was happening. Every mile revealed more abandoned cars, more fires, more of those gray figures wandering through the ruins of civilization. "Dad, look." Katie pointed to a group of people running down the street carrying suitcases and backpacks. "Other people are trying to get out too." "Yeah, baby. Everyone's got the same idea." We were 5 miles from the airport when we hit the real traffic. Cars were backed up for miles, most of them abandoned when their drivers realized they weren't going anywhere. People walked between the vehicles heading in the same direction we were, but they looked scared, desperate. I pulled off the main road and took a service road that ran parallel to the highway. It was rougher, but it was moving. Detroit Metropolitan Airport appeared ahead of us, its control tower dark against the night sky. But as we got closer, I could see something was wrong, very wrong. The main terminal was dark, its windows shattered, but there was activity around the cargo area, military vehicles, their headlights creating harsh islands of white light, and soldiers. I parked the Honda behind a line of abandoned cars about a quarter mile from the terminal. Through the windshield, I could see the situation clearly now. There were planes on the tarmac, big military transports with engines running. People were trying to reach them, families with suitcases and children, running across the open ground toward salvation. But the soldiers weren't helping them board. They were shooting them. "Jesus Christ," I breathed, watching through binoculars I'd grabbed from the house. "They're shooting everyone." "What?" Katie leaned forward. "That can't be right." But it was right. I watched a family of 4, mother, father, 2 small children, running toward the nearest transport. The soldiers opened fire, cutting them down before they got within 100 yards of the plane. They think everyone's infected, I realized. They're not taking any chances. But we're not infected, Katie said. They don't know that. They can't know that. Another group tried to approach from a different angle, and the same thing happened. The soldiers had orders, and those orders were clear. Nobody gets on the planes. There's got to be another way in, I said, studying the airport layout. 23 years of picking up passengers had taught me every entrance, every service road, every back way into the terminal. The cargo entrance, I said, pointing to the far side of the airport. Service road that goes around the back. We can get close to the planes without going through the main terminal. I started the Honda and drove around the perimeter of the airport, headlights off, staying in the shadows. The service road was blocked by a chain-link fence, but it was old and rusted. "Stay in the car," I told Katie. "Dad, what are you doing?" I got out and examined the fence. There was a section near the gate that had been damaged by a previous accident. Bent posts, loose wire mesh. With enough force, I could probably break through. "Let me help," Katie said, getting out of the car. Together, we bent the fence back until there was a gap big enough for the Honda to squeeze through. Then we drove across the tarmac, staying low, heading for the nearest transport plane. It was a massive military cargo aircraft, its rear ramp down, engines spinning. Soldiers were loading equipment, but they hadn't seen us yet. "When I stop the car," I told Katie, "you run for that plane, don't look back." "Dad, I'm not leaving you." "Katie, listen to me." I looked at her seriously. "Those soldiers out front, they're not letting anyone on the planes. But if we can get you inside, if you can hide until they take off, what about you? I'll be right behind you. But you go first, okay? You run as fast as you can." I drove the Honda straight toward the transport, not trying to hide anymore. The soldiers saw us coming and raised their weapons, but I wasn't slowing down. At the last second, I yanked the wheel hard right, sending the car into a skidding turn that brought us alongside the plane's cargo ramp. The soldiers were shouting, running toward us, but they were too late. "Go!" I shouted. "Now!" Katie bailed out of the car and ran for the ramp. I was right behind her, both of us disappearing into the cargo hold just as the soldiers reached the car. Strong hands reached out to pull us inside. Other passengers, other people who'd found their way onto the plane. The soldiers were shouting outside, but the ramp was already beginning to close. Inside the cargo hold, maybe 50 people sat strapped to bench seats along the walls. Families, couples, individuals who'd all found their own ways to reach this plane. A soldier inside the aircraft, a young lieutenant, was checking passengers, making sure everyone was secure for takeoff. When he reached us, he looked at me with tired eyes. "You're not supposed to be here," he said quietly. "I know," I replied, "but we made it." He studied my face, then Katie's. We were scared, exhausted, but we were clearly uninfected. After a moment, he nodded and moved on to the next passenger. The transport plane taxied toward the runway, its engines roaring. Through the small windows, I could see the airport falling apart behind us. More infected were pouring through the terminal, overwhelming the soldiers' positions. The last few military vehicles were pulling back, abandoning the airport entirely. "Dad, look," Katie pointed out the window. Below us, Detroit spread out like a circuit board, streetlights creating patterns in the darkness. But many of those lights were fires now, and the patterns were breaking apart. The plane climbed higher, and the city grew smaller. Soon, Detroit was just a glow on the horizon, then nothing at all. "Where are we going?" Katie asked a crewman. "Toronto," he replied. "Canadian authorities have set up refugee camps. You'll be processed there." I put my arm around Katie and pulled her close. We were alive, we were together, and we were flying away from the hell that Detroit had become. 23 years behind the wheel, driving through those streets, picking up passengers, dropping them off. I'd always thought of it as just a job, just a way to pay the bills. But tonight, all those years of learning the city's secrets, all those shortcuts and back roads had saved our lives. The plane continued north, carrying us toward an uncertain future. But we were together, and we were alive. That was enough. That was everything.